Peter Duo. Yeah. So I understand the class rep will be joining us later. He has talked to me. Yeah? In the meantime, I want to what I'm saying if you have my number, right? As I get there is a disconnect, you just let me know immediately. Yeah. Yeah. You know that Maureen.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Did you stop my recording?
It was a mistake, sir.
Okay. Don't interfere. I have some rights to interfere with I'm the host. What I was just saying, I was just briefing. In case I get lost, you just try to raise me through my phone, just in case I'm not audible or network get lost, right? Well, today we are going to begin with the SMR 411. SMR 411 focuses on the of written vertebrates.
Yes.
Yes. And as we begin, probably most of us would wonder, what are these vertebrates? In some of the written marine vertebrates that we shall be focusing on, and these include species such as the sea turtle, dugongs, the sharks, and we also will be focusing on the seabirds, and a classical example of that are the penguins. What we shall be focusing on, I just wanted to highlight to you so that you come up to speed, at least you have an impression of what this course will be. In a nutshell, this is some of the species that we shall be most concerned with. So, as usual, that this is a timetable. Just a reminder that we shall be having these today on every Tuesday from 9, and we already engagement with you last week. So, what does this course entail? So, the first item that we shall be focusing on, we shall look at just the overview of the written species in general. So in this case, we'll try to understand what we mean by species. So the second item, we'll also look at an overview of the world vertebrates, and that this includes the species, among others that I have just highlighted. So the difference between those two items is that the general now on the overview of the marine vertebrate species. Then we shall further narrow it down, and we shall focus on the status and current threats and the management strategies that are being used on sharks and the rays. This is a group of vertebrates that we've categorized them into several categories. And just to have a direct focus, we shall basically focus on sharks and the rays. Then similarly, the fourth item will be focusing on the same item, but now in this case, we shall only be focusing on the groupers. Then item number 5, we'll look at the status, the current threats, and the management strategies that are already in place to address the seabirds. Then number 6 is the same item, but now with a clear on a focus on the marine mammals. Then lastly, we'll have we'll look at an item focusing only on the marine turtles, but in general, looking at the status, the current threats, and of course the management strategies. Are we together? Inquire. I don't know what among is that a scope that you were expecting from this unit? Hello? Peter Duo? Peter Duo? Is that your expectation so far? Is more or less? Is right now I can't even tell who is online. Nyamoita.
Yes. Yes.
To continue recording this lecture. I think I will have to stop briefly so that I set it up again. I think let me. So expected. I don't know. Is there anybody else with a different opinion, or what did you say? Namita? Is that the expectation from your?
Yeah, and maybe if we look at the body that is responsible for conservation and maybe globally and contexts. And also we go for a trip in an area where we have this conservation taking place in those organizations to know more.
Okay. Anybody else? And as we continue, I will encourage to continue the rest who are not attending classes to be very careful, because everything that you are doing here is actually being monitored. It's for your own interest, and even the attendance that you're having here, it's actually automatically registered. So if you think that you can just come or decide not to be in class, that will be at your own detriment. So it's just putting you on notice. So if that's the case, then you do not have any other suggestions, I think I will continue. I was just confirming whether the going on. Like as usual, I said better part of this semester will be online, and therefore we'll have our first cut a month away from today. There will also be a second cut, which will be in the form of an assignment, and if maybe it could be, we might also do a group presentation, and I'm expecting this should be done before 9th of August. Then when you resume on a face-to-face before the exams, to have a what watch, as Maureen was also requesting. I think we'll make those arrangements so that at least you have a feel of what the institution, and also those that are also focusing on the dolphins and whales that occasionally visit our coastline. And eventually, the final exam. Just to begin, the first thing that we need to ask ourselves, what is this that you are calling threatened species? So what are threatened species? Can someone just explain in a nutshell what are threatened species? When we talk of threatened species, what? Omar.
These are species that are on the verge of going extinct, and if they are not protected, they may disappear from the face of Earth. Salam.
So threatened species are species that are at the risk of going to extinction. That's what you understand by threatened species. Right? Are the rest in agreement with that interpretation or that definition? Yep. So let me just proceed, because this is a very poor form of, sometimes I don't like, because I cannot really look at your faces and ask you right in the face what I want to ask. But basically, threatened species are the species that are considered either critically endangered, or they are endangered, or vulnerable. That is the definition given by National Union for Conservation of Nature. This is one of the bodies, as Moreno was asking, would like to be acquainted with the institution that are concerned with the conservation of the threatened species. So this is one of the institution, and it's internationally recognized as the main institution that is focused, that really focuses on conservation of threatened species. So what I really want to underscore is that threatened species are basically those that are critically endangered, or they are endangered, or they are vulnerable. And I think in the past classes and other units, we have many marine ones on, and of course, vertebrates that are critically endangered or they're endangered. And I think either in SMR 303 coastal forest, we have mentioned species, so many species that are endangered. Even in SMA, is it conservation areas, we have mentioned species that are also critically endangered, particularly in Kenya. So we'll be looking at those species and we mean by endangered or vulnerable. So the criteria that result in taxa being recognized is being categorized as threatened. When a species is to be threatened, what it basically means is that there is reduction in the size of that population. That is one of the things that it qualifies for. If the population is highly reduced, then that particular species is considered to be threatened. Number two, the criteria that again is used to categorize them is the geographical range. How distributed are they? Are they only restricted in particular areas, or are they in terms of global distribution? Mainly to find those species. Again, in terms of population sizes, I mean, what is the status of those species? And again, the last criteria that is also being used is the probability of their extinction in the wild. Why do we use IUCN Red List, or what is IUCN Red List? So IUCN Red List basically refers to the global gold standard. It's like a standard that is being used globally, and it's globally accepted for evaluating the relative extinction risk. So this is a standard that is accepted by everyone, that is used to threatened and which ones are not. So overall, we have 9 categories of that is used to evaluate the extinction risk. And what you have here, we 9, that is the extinct in the wild. Then we have critically endangered species, we have the endangered species, we have the vulnerable species. We have and we also have and we also have another category of species that are not evaluated. So this is all the categories that are being. You have all the way to a species that has been extinct. So, but the focus of this unit, we shall only be focusing on 3 categories of what we are referring as the categories. So the 3 threatened categories comprise of the critically endangered species, the endangered ones, and the vulnerable ones. When we say that a species is extinct, for example, what does that mean? So that means that that particular species is no longer only here subspecies. They're not in existence anymore. So then we have the second category, which is, and therefore when you say that a species, there is no is in existence. So a species is usually presumed to be extinct when the efforts in terms of assessment has shown that they don't exist in the habitat. And these surveys need to be exhaustive, meaning that they have to be done in all seasons. They have to be done throughout the year, and they have to be done even diurnally, meaning you have to do assessment like in 24-hour cycles to ensure that they are declared to be extinct. So when we again say that a species is extinct in the wild, it basically means that they only exist in captivity. And those are not available, they are not there in the wild. So when do we consider then that a species does not exist again in the wild? They, again, similarly, when a species is extinct in the wild, it is only known to survive, therefore, in captivity. And therefore, it's presumed, therefore, to be extinct in the wild. All exhaustive have been done. And in all the habitats, again, and their historic range have failed any individual, those that are in captivity. And therefore, those two groups are not of our concern or within the scope of this unit. And therefore, this particular unit will focus only on the critically endangered species, and the critically endangered species in this case means that these are species that are extremely, that have extremely high risk of extinction in the wild, and therefore they are likely to slip in extinction, either completely or only remain in captivity. So, and therefore we have some of the species that are already in this category that are only extinct in the wild. Then we have the fourth category, which is the endangered species. And again, these are species that have high risk of extinction in the wild. And then the species that and therefore, a species is considered vulnerable when it high risk of extinction in the wild. So the sixth category are the threatened species. Threatened species basically refers to that, it means that these species are likely in a future, and therefore they are be in this category of threatened species if conservation efforts are relaxed or they are not enhanced. Then we also have the least concerned species, and these are the lowest risk species. And this particular species does not qualify for a more at the risk category, and therefore they are widespread and they are abundant in the wild, and therefore they are of least concern. But this does not mean that those species are not important or they don't need to be conserved, because we still need to know their status at any one particular moment. And therefore, assessments have to be done all the time to ensure that the levels remain as remain to be healthy, or they are well distributed and the numbers are not declining. Similar to groups, we have the data deficient species. The data deficient species, we do not have enough data to make an assessment of whether they are at risk or not. So the data deficient species are species that requires a lot of assessment and effort, so that they are critically endangered, they are vulnerable, and the like. And therefore, more effort also needs. Meaning nothing is known about them. Unlike the data deficient, their data deficient species could be known. Their distribution, their preliminary assessment, but those assessments are not exhaustive, and therefore they still do not qualify for assessment, for a risk assessment. So those that are not assessed, a lot of research also needs to be focused on areas, on species that have not been evaluated. So some of the examples of the species, of course, include the dinosaur, and of course we have other species like the golden toad, which have never been seen since 1989 in the wild. Therefore, such a species is also considered to be extinct. So the IUCN Red List basically provides, in a nutshell, it provides information about the range, how they are distributed, in terms of population size. So we need to know the assessment. That's why institutions like Kenya Wildlife Service have to do regular surveys. I think not so long ago, you remember, I think a month, 2, 3 or so weeks ago, the CS of wildlife was launching a national census of wildlife. And therefore, this is part of the efforts that are being done for the numbers of different species. And this is a regular assessment that is issued. Is also, IUCN also enhances habitat, look at the habitat and ecology use of this species. They also assess the use and trade. Again, they give the conservation actions, the strategies that need to be put in place to ensure that these species are conserved. So all this information that is generated from this assessment by IUCN help in the conservation and those particular species that have been assessed. And more importantly, the ones that are threatened, critically endangered. So as of one, many species groups in general have been assessed, including various mammals, amphibians, birds, have been comprehensively assessed through IUCN organization. So done. The IUCN Red List continue to reassess the status of some existing species, sometimes with positive stories to tell, and sometimes with sad stories to tell. And that's why our institution, our local institutions, for example, Kenya Wildlife Service, have to continue assessing and doing surveys of species. For example, when you look at terrestrial species, for example. We have endangered species such as the black rhinos, we have the endangered species such as the elephants. That's where much focus is on. And just because we know the numbers this year, and we have already assessed and allocated, or rather enlisted that species as endangered or critically endangered, the assessment does not stop there. There has to be regular assessment so that we get to know whether we need to upgrade that species. If it is critically endangered, do we downgrade it because the management has been good? Do we downgrade it to critically to endangered level, or do we uplift a species that was vulnerable to an endangered species? That's why regular assessments have to be done, and that has been going on through IUCN effort. First reading assignments as concerns evaluation of species as whether they are critically endangered or vulnerable, because that's unit. I want you to look at, can you look at the criteria that is being used to evaluate whether a particular species is critically endangered, or vulnerable? What are the criteria? I have already highlighted. They look at the population sizes, they look at the range, they look at many other factors, but basically there are 5 main factors they actually consider for a species to be considered threatened. So your reading assignment, first reading assignment, is to look at the criteria that is being used in depth. Is there any question up to there so far? Are you, or you disappeared?
We are still here.
All right. So what is of as of 21? So a lot of assessment have already been done. And this has been a continuous assessment of species. Even as we speak today, there are people in the field continuing to do assessment of particular species. So far, as of this year, you can actually see that the assessment has been going on as from 2000, they had done less than 20,000 assessment of particular species. But as of this year, as of this year, they have already done assessment of approximately 400 species, according to the IUCN red list. So globally, we are not, the world is not to approximately 2.2 million different species. So out of all those species, only 134 have been done, meaning we still have a long way to go. If we were to know when you talk of assessment, they know the exact numbers, their distribution, their global distribution, their ecology, and the like. That is thorough species assessment. So out of all the species that have been thoroughly assessed, 28% of those species, which is that 400 species, have already been declared threatened with extinction. So, and that is what you have as the red graph. Out of all the species that is being assessed, 28% of those particular species are considered to be threatened. So Out of those species that have been assessed as of 2021, 41% of all the assessed amphibians are qualified as threatened. Out of all the species that have been assessed, of all the plants that have been assessed, 34% of them
The only one who's not getting.
He left.
Inasisi Lulaza. Morina anafikiria trip pekee.
More, mwambie tunataka twende. Mwambie tunataka twende whale watching.
Si ndio tunaenda Watamu, allowance lazima tupate.
Owino.
Shida ni Mandela uko Kisii. Hawezi choma fare uje uchukue allowance ya 300.
Ayo lazima nifikie next week, niko Mombasa bana.
Taduo, you are given an assignment to call daktari. Tell him he's not in class.
Oya buda, hakuna haja umcall bana, tutulie. Hai.
Mr. Daktari, yambiana hayuko class.
Simtulie nini? Kwani si anajua ame left bana?
Tutulie, si ndio? To make two stories huko hivi.
Cheza low buda.
Acheni watu wapumzike bwana.
Wengine wetu hatujalala usiku. Naona Isaac Rimba.
Semaje?
Endelea vipi bana?
Niko
Lesta kovuna.
Ilikuwa Mudhegi. Mwandikwa. Mandela unadai.
Mandela hujamwambia fiti.
More anapost Kiswahili lakini ikuji bana.
Huyu ameamkia ugali na matoke miningi.
Plus imebounce ama nini?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we're getting you clear.
All right. Sorry for that disruption.
Yes, yes.
I'm told you lost me. I was just talking. I think you lost me here, right? Okay.
Yes.
I think I will continue without full screen so that in case you lose me, I'll know, right? Is everyone able to see that?
Yeah.
So if you lose me again, just give me a buzz, yeah? All right. I was talking about, I think we had already, I was saying out of all the species that have already been assessed, 41% of all the amphibians that have been assessed are considered to be threatened, meaning they are in that category of species that are critically endangered, or they're endangered, or they are vulnerable. Again, out of all the plans that have been assessed, that are assessed, that 4% of all those species, again, are considered to be in that category of threatened species. Again, out of all the reef building corals that have been assessed at 3% threatened, and 20 that have been assessed, and again, are also considered to be threatened. Species of birds that have been assessed, 14% are considered to be. So basically what I was saying, out of this assessment by IUCN, the group of species that are considered to be highly threatened are the amphibians. And while the list of the species that are considered to be threatened are the birds in general, irrespective of whether they are marine or they are terrestrial species. So this continuous assessment of species help IUCN to come up with what we call a barometer of life. So, like, I don't know, you all know what that is, an instrument that is used. So when we do assessment, so those assessments, continuous assessments, contributes to a measure of pressure on species. So the target for the year 2022 is to ensure that IUCN done assessment or has facilitated assessments of around 100 species, as opposed to what is currently done, which is approximately 134 species globally. So with this continuous assessment, this list help to guide and inform future conservation and funding priorities. Where should funding be focused on? Because the institution that fund these kind of assessments will focus on species that are obviously endangered, as opposed to species that are of least concern. So if you, for example, you guys, if you want to attract funding in future, you need to focus on species that are endangered. You add value to that. There are higher chances that you will get funding if you focus on those species, as opposed to those species that are of least concern, and especially if you really want funding from IUCN. So IUCN Red List is therefore often referred as the barometer species, and therefore it guides and informs conservation action to help prevent extinction in the future. So like I mentioned earlier, the target is to ensure that 160 species have been assessed by the end of 2022. So, and how are they strategizing to do this? The first strategy is to increase the number of experts, is to train more people, is to engage in a species assessment, for example, so that there is more assessment going on, and therefore contributing to the IUCN Red List assessment. And then the second strategy, increase the number of tests each year. And that's why they're coming up with this strategy of this target of at least ensuring that by the year 2022, should have assessed in total. So in the year 2000, the number of species that had been assessed was all species. So you can actually, when you look at that graph that I was showing here, you can see that there is continuous improvement by the IUCN to continue facilitating assessment. Of course, sometimes there is a dam, then there is increase, meaning this all depends on the funding and interest and availability of experts to assess. So the one thing that you can actually notice when you look at 2019, between 2019 and 2022, there is also a slow of assessments. What Omar? Paul Kalami?
Yes.
Do you notice that between 2019 and maybe 2022, when you look at both graphs, the total species assessed and the total threatened species, there is a small dump in the assessment. Do you notice that? Do you notice that there is a small drop in, I mean, it's supposed to be exponential increase in the number of assessment, but there is a decrease in that slope. Can you all
Yes.
notice that?
Yes.
So, in your opinion, what do you think could have contributed probably to that? Can someone guess what could? I mean, of course, there are many factors that can contribute to that because that's not the only time. But one very obvious reason that may have contributed to that could also be the pandemic that activities. And therefore, between the year 2020 and 2021, when the corona pandemic hit the world, that could have contributed to less assessment being conducted because when there is less conduct and people are not traveling, that basically will also slow a lot of activity. Contributed by that, among other factors, of course. So we were here where I was saying that we need number of species assessed each year for us to be able to reach the target of 160 species that need to have been assessed by the end of 2022. So when you look at the current IUCN, you'll notice that first we have the vertebrate species, we have the invertebrates, we have the plants, and of course we have the fungi and other small species. So when you look at assessment as of 2021, it is 4,807. But the target by 2022 is to ensure that that has increased to 61,000. The same case applies to invertebrates and other. So currently, like I mentioned earlier, 134 species have been assessed, but the target is to ensure that their assessment of 160,000 species have been done. So the IUCN Red List of threatened species is a continuous line, shows a continuous line all the way from 2000 to 2020, to 2021. So for us to be able to reach the 160, we'll need to have that continuous line. But there are higher chances, considering the difficult time that we are in at the moment, that there are very minimal chances that we'll be able to achieve that target by the 2021, by the year 2022, because of the challenges that we have at the moment. So the number of species still to be assessed to reach 106 is the red dotted line. So that is just a target, and that we actually, even in normal life, we just give ourselves target. Sometimes we overdo the target, or sometimes we perform below the targets because of various reasons. So the limitation, some of the limitation of the current species assessment, when you look at the current species assessment, what are some of the limitations? When you look at the general picture of what you have in front of you, we have the vertebrates, we have the invertebrates, we have the plants and other species. You will notice that one of the limitation of the bias that you actually notice from this assessment is that the species group are biased towards the terrestrial species, and particularly the plant, the forest ecosystems. There is so much assessment that have already been done in the terrestrial ecosystem as compared to marine ecosystem. There's also a strong bias to plants and other species. So there is so much focus on animals as compared to other species, because when you look at the vertebrates, you combine it with the invertebrates, it's almost half of the assessed species as compared to what has been done already in terms of plants and other species. Then the third limitation of the current status is that not all taxonomic groups have completely been assessed. There is a lot of bias towards particular taxonomic groups, particularly when you look at the fungi, for example, and other groups. There is very minimal focus on those species, yet they are equally important for a healthy ecosystem. Then the fourth limitation is that the extinction risk assessment have been completed for around 6% of the wild described species. So what is the number of species that we said we have globally? The approximate number? Maureen?
2,240,000.
That's the have. So out of all those species that are known, they're only known to be, but extinction risk 134 species out of all that, meaning you and I and many other scientists, we have a long way to go. So there is still a lot that is still under. Percent of all the species have not been described yet, have not been assessed yet thoroughly. You only know their existence, and not much work has been for this list. So IUCN list is a list. So it's not a list
sir.
that is. Are you saying something?
So, yeah, I have a question. So does it mean that most of the species in the world, they belong to the data deficient category?
Yes, a lot, because according to the IUCN, and this is the world accepted list. Yeah? 34 species have been category that we know. We do not many other species. Of course, those that have been assessed, of course, there are other species that have been assessed and they are known not to have issues, and therefore they are considered to be of least concern, right? But that does not mean that the assessment need to stop. The assessment need to be. When you look at of when we're doing, for example, surveys, like what? Like this aerial survey, for example, they do large. Can do elephant count, but when they are doing the elephant count, they also count other less important. They will look at the zebras and the like. So elephants are considered to be endangered, and therefore there is need to continue assessing them regularly. That's when they're expected to have increased, right? So, but as long as you do those assessments, you also have in as much as that not to be endangered, but we still need to know their status. Did I answer you right?
Yes.
So, IUCN Red List is a dynamic list. It keeps improving, it keeps changing every year. So, and some of the reason for changing this status is because some species will improve. They will be downgraded from being critically endangered sometimes to endangered, or from being endangered to being vulnerable. Or in the worst case scenario, they may change from being vulnerable to being endangered, or from species of least concern to being in the threatened species. Am I still there? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I had someone coming. I think I'm fearing every time I. So therefore, some of the reasons that contribute to changing status, for example, is availability of new information. So new information become available. This is the last assessment. If as I go, for example, in the case of elephants, there will be new information either confirming that the numbers have increased, and they are available on population sizes. They'll be available on the threatening processes and the rate of decline. And therefore, that can either change the status of a particular species from being endangered to whichever category. The other reason is the taxonomic revision. Sometimes a species that was considered to be of certain species and come up with two different species. So that is what we are calling taxonomic revision. So resulting in species being no longer being same, and therefore they'll have to be categorized. And could be one could qualify for another level. It is now, if a species is split into several species with smaller ranges or population sizes, or it has been merged with other species, and therefore the range could be bigger as well as the numbers, and therefore they no longer qualify as they were previously. So the other reason for a dynamic status is an error, if an error has been discovered in the previous assessment. If the previous assessment was done, then As we do the second assessment, you realize that there was an error in the way the previous assessment was done. For example, maybe the wrong information was used. The IUCN red list categories and criteria were being applied incorrectly. And I can give an example of this. In Kenya, in the recent past, we have a particular antelope, a duiker, that is actually known to be a resident on, right? But due to some assessments that were done in Boni forest, sometimes back when I was still, that kind of assessment can actually show that that particular species is not constrained in terms of range only in Shimba Hills. Other regions such as the Mboni forest. And the reason as to why that was not the case in the past is because of the security reasons, and therefore assessment could not have been done in that is known to be very with the improvement in security. When the assessment was done there, very thorough assessment, there we realized that those speakers are also present also in Boni. And therefore, that can change the status of that particular species from being maybe critically endangered to being reduced to just being endangered. Reason could be the previous assessment may have used in red list category and criteria. And therefore, the reassessment uses the current criteria, which have been slightly different threshold. So time and again, IUCN revises the criteria that they use to assess the species. And therefore, when they revise those criteria, those criteria can qualify some species to be either to be moved in either of the 3 or of the 9 categories. And lastly, the main threat may no longer be present, or they have been. Probably the reason we were losing a particular species at very high risk is because of the security reasons. For example, in the case of we have so much poaching going on, but if we improve the management measures and those threats are removed, that particular species, their distribution, and in terms of the population sizes or numbers, that can warrant again the revision of that particular species from being either the reintroduction of species in areas that were earlier disseminated, or creating habitat protection, like winning space for wildlife, for example, and restoring those particular species, and that can improve the species. For example, with the Tengefu concept, where we are using communities to conserve, and therefore species can actually improve. And when that happens, can actually as less endangered, and any other measures could be improved management of the species. Other reasons have continued unabated. or rather, if you will, that the main threat have actually increased, or the new threat have developed, causing the status of the species to even deteriorate beyond its previous status. And that can again warrant the upgrading of that particular species from being either endangered to critically endangered, or from vulnerable to endangered, and the like. So as a result of this continuous assessment, because it's not a static process, it has to be done regularly. Just because we did assessment last year, it doesn't mean to be of least concern, it doesn't stop there. Or we have qualified as to be critically endangered, it doesn't stop there. There has to be continuous, it's a continuous process, and therefore assessment to be done all the time. So all assessments, all have been already enlisted on the IUCN need to be reassessed from time to time to include record of reason for any change in the red list category. You repeat assessment, then you either say that that species should remain in that category, or should be upgraded, or should be downgraded. And therefore, this allows for identification of species that are genuinely improving, or those species that are deteriorating in status. And as a result of this continuous assessment, data for species that are genuinely changing status are used to calculate what we refer as the red list index. And this is the index that is used to either justify whether a species is supposed to be downgraded or upgraded. So what is IUCN red list index? So IUCN red list index is an index that shows the trend in overall extinction rate for species, and it's used by different governments to track their progress towards target for reducing biodiversity loss. Are we improving in management? Are we improving in conservation, or are we not? Or are we not improving in conservation? So the most species that move from between categories on the IUCN red list do so because of improved knowledge or revised taxonomy. And therefore, it's therefore of species simply by looking at overall change in numbers. You cannot just look at what was the assessment 4 years ago and the assessment 4 years later, and then you make a decision over long period of time. And therefore, that's what will give an indication in terms of index, whether the particular species is improving or not. Are we together? So in order to address this, the red list index basically shows the trend in the status of group of species based only on genuine improvement or deterioration in status of sufficient magnitude to qualify species either as threatened or less threatened. So what we have here in this figure is the red list index for various groups that we have already mentioned. We have the coral reef, we have the birds, we have the mammals, we have the amphibians, and we have other plants like cycads, right? So when you look at this figure, what we have on the y-axis is the red list index of species survival, and what you have in the x-axis is the year as to when there's. So you can actually see a blue line. So the blue line basically indicates the overall red list index for all. And what does it indicate? Although, because you are the one who will tell me whether I'm on board or not. Though, how do you interpret that? When you look at that figure, we have the red list index for the overall. What we have in blue is the overall for all corals, amphibians, and the cycad. So what's your interpretation of that? That's very right. When you look at in 1990, the red list was around 0.8. But as of 2020, that has reduced to almost 0.7. And therefore, we should have a reason to worry, because in general, what that means is that we are losing a lot of species. There are many species that are getting going at the risk of extinction or qualifying in those three categories, which is a reason to get worried. So I'd like to explain what it means. That first, the blue line basically indicates the overall red line index for all the species combined. However, coral reefs are moving towards extinction rate, while amphibians, on average, are the most threatened animal group. And I think I had already mentioned this at the beginning, that when you compare all these taxonomic groups, amphibians are the most threatened animal species. But when you look at the coral reef, you can actually, when you look at that slope, it's a slope that is actually worrying, because we are losing the coral reef at a very high rate as compared to any other group. Red list index value of 1. When you look at list index of 1, this equates to all species qualifying as a least concern, which could move towards what will be less concerned about their risk of extinction. But when you look at all the graphs, they are all facing downwards, except probably mammals that you can actually see that it's slightly improving. So similarly, when you look at the red list index value of 0, if we have red list of 0, that means all the species are going to get extinct. And that's the trend. When you look at the trend, if the trend continues like that for the
Peter.
Though, bring the
Rada.
lecturer back.
Si saa break bana. Najua nyinyi mnanyanga breakfast na lunch pamoja. Sasa kwa lunch.
Pale kwa Joe.
Kalami. Kalami. Sana kingai.
Tumia wifi yake hiyo.
Class imeisha.
Oh, not yet. Not yet. I'm back. I'm back. Yeah, we'll be done in a moment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I hear you right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, this hotspot keep kicking me out, but just bear with me. You cannot see my screen, right?
Yes, we
Can you see
can't
my
see.
screen?
No.
We ain't seeing it.
Just a moment. Just hold on. I think I need to. This technology will kill me one day. Can you see me now?
Yeah, we can see you.
That's where I was before the interruption.
Yes.
Picture basically shows that we are on the decline when it comes to the loss of species. And that should actually be very worrying, right? But among this, when you look at now individually among these groups, you will notice, for example, that the birds are showing a consistent mammals. Slightly, you can see that the amphibians a little bit have a steeper slope as compared to other. So, overall, red list index for all the species combined. But when you look at the coral reefs, the coral reef species are moving toward increasing in risk as compared to other groups. Because of when you look at that slope, you can actually see that it's moving from one rarely towards all the way 2010 during the last assessment of most of the reef. It's actually at almost 0.8 meaning we have lost already two. Similarly, when you look at the amphibians among the animals, on average, they are the most threatened group. And I think I already mentioned that earlier, and that can be interpreted from the fact that they are showing the lowest index of 0.75. So a red lit index of 1 equates to all species qualifying, therefore, as a, meaning they're not expected to become extinct in the near future. That's what it actually means. But if we have a red list index of 0, if we have a red list index of, then that equates to species are going to get extinct. And when you look at the trend at which the reef are moving, they're actually moving towards lower. Of course, it's at bad, but it's actually moving at a very threatening trend. If the R red lit index, like we are seeing with the birds, with the mammals over time, then it indicates that the overall extinction rate for that group is unchanged. And therefore, what needs to be done is to maintain the status quo, is to maintain what's in. Do not need to relax those efforts. For example, we are conserving, we are creating more protected areas for these species. Institution in place that ensure that those species are not being managed properly. We need to continue like that. So if the biodiversity loss were reducing, then the an upward trend. But when you look at what we have on the figure, is there any taxonomic group that is showing an upward trend? Is there? So
No.
they're all showing a downward trend. Is there? And that should be a reason to get worried. So we can actually see that we are doing well with birds. We are doing well with the mammals. It's declining, but it really, we should actually, the desire is to have an upward trend. But none of these taxonomic groups that we are describing here does show that kind of a trend. They are showing a downward trend, saying be highly concerned. The red lit index is available only for 5 taxonomic groups. That is the birds, the mammals, the coral, amphibians, and therefore there is need to continue assessing many other species. We have seen that the number of zones therefore shows that and if that was to be done, there is a very high likelihood that these dynamics, these trends actually change, give us a picture. So the red list index, therefore, clearly demonstrates the status of major group is declining as depicted by that blue line. But that is red list index. That's according to the IUCN. Now the big question is Is it the only tool that we use to assess the conservation status of species? We've been focusing now at least. So my big question is this the only tool that can be used? Of course, it's one of the best and renowned tool, but is that the only tool? Not the only instrument? Back to you guys.
It is not the only one.
Yeah. What else can be used? It's not what?
It's not the only which uses the.
You have the CBD.
Yes, CBD appendices.
Are they like appendices? Maureen?
Yes.
CBD stands for what?
Diversity.
Do you have appendices on that?
Appendices which are used to assess the
status of species.
yes.
Like CBD, we actually have we have a convention that focuses on the migratory species. For example, we have what do you call that convention that focuses on migratory species? Convention on Migratory Species. So after the IUCN Red List, the other second most renowned tool that is also used to, or rather applied to demonstrate the status of conservation or status of our species in such as the CITES. We all know what CITES stands for, is it? Yeah. So we have other tools, and stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of the Wild, Flora and Fauna. So CITES is an international agreement between governments that tries to protect or ensure that the trade in species, be they animals or plants, does not threaten survival. So when a party, for example, to CITES, we abide by the regulation that have been set by that particular so annually, every year, we are losing a lot of wildlife. And annually, international trade is estimated to be worth billions of dollars, involving hundreds of plants. We all know that there are so many species that are considered to be endangered, and there are so many species that are engaged in trade. For example, when you go to even to our airport, you will actually find the presence of Kenya Wildlife Service. They are there with their sniffing dogs, and they have intelligence place or to check to check for illegal trade involving wild. And the best known, of course, is the trade in ivory, the trade in rhino horns, and the trade in so many. So that's what Kenya to CITES, so that we continue protecting what we consider to be endangered in our country. So the trade is live animals to vast array of wildlife products derived from them, including food products, exotic leather goods, wood, musical instrument, timber, and the like, tourist curios and medicine. So there are so many species. We also have marine species, particularly the reef, coral reef fish for what do you call it? The aquarium fish that are being traded, some of them legally and others illegally. And therefore, that's why there is need how you cannot, trade has to continue, but it needs to be regulated. So the level of exploitation of some animals and plants are very high, and the trade in them together with other factors such as habitat loss are capable of heavily depleting. We don't in them. If they're bringing in cash, people out there to make money by all means. And therefore, if we do not control how that is being, how that is done, we are likely to because of the trade in these animals and plants across the border, there is need to regulate it, and it requires international cooperation. We need to international states to safeguard certain species from getting exploited. So, and therefore, CITES was actually conceived in the spirit of such cooperation, so that we regulate the trade in these species. So as of today, CITES are called varying degrees of protection, and they have protection for more than 37,000 species. So when you look at that compared to what we have for the IUCN, you can actually see that IUCN is the best in terms of protecting the species. But that does not mean that CITES is not equally doing its job. But we can see that from CITES, CITES have been able to protect, or rather enlisted, approximately 37 species of animals and plants in general. So there are so many countries that are a party to this convention. We have approximately 183 countries that are a party to CITES. And of course, this keeps changing. Some of them withdraw, some of them continue joining. And therefore, it's also a very dynamic convention where we have many countries joining and others sometimes leaving, but rarely does that happen. So in terms of CITES, CITES have different degrees of protection. They have 3 degrees of protection. Just like we have with the IUCN, we have 9 categories, but in CITES we have 3. They are species into 3 categories. We refer as the appendices as more. CITES accord varying degrees of protection to all these that 6,000 species, including both animals and plants, provisions to species. So we have Appendix 1, Appendix 2, and Appendix 3. So in Appendix 1, out of all that 6 species, that 6,000 species, only 3% qualify to be in appendix. Then majority of the species are in Appendix 2, and we have very few species in Appendix 3. So the species that qualify to be in Appendix 1 are species threatened with extinction. So most of the species that are in the IUCN red list and critically endangered, most of those species also qualify to be in Appendix 1. And therefore, in as much as trade in wildlife species is international commercial trade of species that are in Appendix 1 is prohibited. And that is agreed upon by all countries that are a party to this particular that are party to CITES. And therefore, for example, a species such as black rhino, trade, black rhino, it is not allowed anyway, in as much as it's allowed, you still see it being traded, it's actually illegal. Then we have species that have been enlisted in Appendix 2. And these species, this is where we have majority of the species that have been assessed, that have been assessed by through CITES. So these species are not necessarily threatened with extinction. They become so unless trade is regulated. Some of them could be endangered. For example, when you look at a species such as elephants, elephants is actually enlisted as endangered. And therefore, there is need to regulate on how we trade with specimen coming from such species. For example, the effort we have been, the effort, for example, when you go for these COPs meetings, when you look at a species such as elephants, there are countries in ivory. And most of these countries include the African countries in southern part of Africa, such as South Africa, Zambia, and also Tanzania. They actually allow trading. But in Kenya, we've actually noticed most of the time that the ivory that we have is usually destroyed. The purpose of this is to restrict trade in, or rather, to restrict trade in this kind of species. But some countries allow trade in those kind of in ivory, and therefore they are given a moratorium. They're given moratorium to either clear their stocks within 2 years, then they're given a stop for probably another 10 years. So they keep accumulating this. And the purpose of doing that is to regulate trade in those species. So in trade for this particular in Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 is allowed, but they have to be highly controlled. And therefore, that's why we have this kind of conditions for this period of clearing of the stockpiles. And after clearing of the stockpile, there is a stop, or there is a ban on trade on those particular species. Then we have species that are enlisted in Appendix 3, according to CITES. And those species, regulation of the party in the country of interest. And the only requirement for that kind of a species that has been listed is it requires cooperation from other parties to regulate on how they control the international trade. In other words, what it means is that we have international species it included in the appendix, the convention must fulfill certain conditions for you to trade in a particular species. According must any country or any party that wants to engage of certain species must fulfill at least those three conditions. The first condition is the traceability. Where is that species coming from? Is it possible to trace where that particular species has come from? So the specimen has been and regulation for the protection of flora and fauna. And therefore, if you want to trade in any flora and fauna, you must get a license. For example, in Kenya, if you want to trade in any flora and fauna, you must get a license from Kenya Wildlife Service for you to export anything. That has to be regulated and is to control the traceability. Where did this particular species come from? So if you have to export something, you must have that certificate so that it can be traced that this particular specimen came from Kenya, where they allow trade in this particular species. So the parties must make legal acquisition finding to confirm this, and they can only confirm this if you have a permit to export that particular. Number two condition is that it must meet the sustainability condition. So countries that are party they must make non-detrimental finding. There has to be science-based biological finding which confirm that the trade in that particular species is sustainable and will not be detrimental to the survival of that species and take account of the role of species in its system. So therefore, what that basically means is that as a country, if you want to trade, for example, in aloe vera or in a particular reef species, be it coral reef, be it the fish species, you need to do regular assessment and confirm that that particular species is not in danger, irrespective of the trade. For you to be allowed to trade in that, show as based evidence that that particular species is not in danger. Then lastly is the traceability. So what it means is that able to trace it back where a particular species came from. So parties must ensure that the trade can be traced through issuance and control of appropriate permits and therefore on all and certificates that have been issued in national annual report. And this has to be documented through a database in the CITES that can be where you every issue, every permit you give must appear in that database of CITES. I wish to leave it at that, not unless invite any questions as regards to threatened species and how they are controlled. The only the only instruments, but at least these two are the most important instruments, the IUCN red list and the CITES. We also have other species that are also enlisted in the migratory species. We also have a similar kind of arrangement listing species in those in different conservation. Am I still up there? Duo, are you still on board? So, is there any question?
These conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Number 3, I think they're the same.
What and what?
Condition 1.
Oh yes. I guess you are right. Let me. The description is different. You mean what? There is an aspect of traceability, and there is also an aspect on what? Sustainability. We should there has to be an aspect on sustainability that when trade on a particular species, it has to be right, and you also have to trace it. It should be it's supposed to be traceable that it came from a particular country, and but the last the condition, let me I think I've written it quickly. Let me. Back to you in a moment. I guess I must have confused that with something else. Beside that, is there any other question? I'll get back to you in a moment on that. Any other concern?
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
You were to facilitate for us the permit letters for that. Yeah, just to remind you.
I was to do what?
You are to write for us a recommendation letter.
I already did.
Okay.
Check with you. I thought you all have access to the email, the common email. Are you?
We have.
Does it feel
Wewe leo jana? Bandos, kuna class nyingine?
Unless daktari aseme.
Ka Dr. Tamo ameleft, mimi na left. Utukobi.
Wewe
Eh? Nini Nathan? Kuna class nyingine. Nathan, kwani uko mjei bana?
nanyonga. Yes. Uma,
Ni kama ako jikoni.
Can you still hear me?
So Peter kuna class.
Hello? Yes, sorry
Yes,
for
yes.
that again. Hello? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I don't know at what point I got lost again. There was someone asking whether I said I have already shared that letter, which should be accessible to everyone. You just need to indicate your name and your registration number, and that should work. Should you have challenges, just let me know. I can see how else to help. I think there was someone who was asking a question about the conditions that must be met for any country to partake in trade in flora and fauna that are of concern, that are threatened. And I said you need that. You need for that country to qualify to partake in the trade. It must meet or rather fulfill 3 conditions. And one of them is the traceability. And I think one of you said that I have indicated the same. Condition 1 and condition 3 are the same, right? Can you see?
Yes.
Can you still see my slide there? Yeah. So the first one is actually legality. Yeah. As you can actually tell from the narrative that and there are particular species that are considered to be that you can trade in, that you can actually even trade in terms of look at the schedule 3 of the Wildlife Act. There are those particular species that have been legalized for trade, right? So for you to trade in certain species, they must be a particular country. And that's what I'm calling as legality. Then on traceability, the same institution that are coming up with regulation must, for example, Kenya Wildlife Service must give a permit. And that's what I was referring as the traceability. You should be able to trace, was this particular species that you want to trade in, was it permitted by regulation by the... Is that clear?
Yes.
I don't know who was asking that, right?
Yes, it is clear now.
All right, then I just wish to leave it at that for today, and hope to okay, bye.
Thank you.